Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to review Mary Jane by Jessica Anya Blau. This book was published in 2021 by Custom House, which is an imprint of William Morrow, and William Morrow is an imprint of HarperCollins. The hardcover of this book comes in at 320 pages. However, I split my time reading this book between an ebook and an audiobook, both of which I checked out from my local library. This is a coming-of-age novel set in 1975. The title character, Mary Jane Dillard, is 14 years old, and she gets a job as a babysitter for the summer. Her two closest friends, they're twins, they're away at summer camp the whole summer long. She doesn't particularly want to go to camp, nor does she want to stay at home with her mother helping with housework all day long, every single day for the summer. So getting a summer job seems like a much better alternative. Mary Jane is kind of your girl next door kind of character. In some ways, she's a typical 14-year-old girl, and then in other ways, she's kind of not, because she doesn't really have any rebellious streak in her at the point we meet her. And at the point we meet her, we've seen that she's been growing up and is continuing to grow up in a very structured, very strict, and in my opinion, very sterile household. Things have to be just so around her mother. Her dad works and then comes home. There isn't a whole lot of outward love and affection, and this is all Mary Jane has ever known. So as a result, she's very obedient. She helps her mother, she listens to her father, and she sings at church. But if it wasn't clear to Mary Jane before just how tame and orderly her life is with her parents, it becomes abundantly clear the moment she steps inside the house where she's going to be working for the entire summer, which is actually the opening scene of this novel. There are things strewn everywhere in this house. It is chaos. It looks like a tornado has recently struck. And that in contrast to her mother's house that her mom keeps almost obsessively clean. It's quite a difference from what she's used to. In that opening scene, Mrs. Cone, the mother of the household, explains to Mary Jane that she and her husband need someone to basically hang out with their very precocious 5-year-old daughter, Isabel, Izzy for short, because Izzy doesn't have a whole lot of friends her own age. She much prefers spending time with adults, meaning she likes to be around her parents, but they have a lot of things going on over the summer, so they need someone to be a companion for Izzy, to look out for her while they're doing their own things. But there's really not much more of a job description than that, so in the early pages, we're just kind of along for the ride, figuring out this job with Mary Jane, since I don't think she's ever held a babysitter position before. She's trying to figure out where to find everything, what's appropriate in this new household, and she's also getting to know the new family members, most importantly, her young charge, Izzy. But this story really gets started when Mr. Cone, who is a psychiatrist, that's what he does for a living, he tells Mary Jane that they're going to have two very special guests moving into the household for the entire summer. There is a very famous rock star with addiction issues. So he and his also very famous wife are going to move into this house for the entire summer so that the rock star can get specialized one-on-one treatment and hopefully move past his addiction problems. Well, they have to keep it a secret that they're going to be in town, this suburb of Baltimore, Maryland, because they need the privacy, they want to lay low. So Mr. Cone asks Mary Jane to help him keep this secret, which means that for the first time in her life, Mary Jane will have to lie to her mother because her mother would not approve of her working in a household where a drug addict is living. Once these two stars come to stay and they've been there for a little while, something really special starts to happen. The entire household becomes its own type of family. There's always laughter and there's always music because these two celebrities love to play music, they love to sing, and Mary Jane, like I said before, she sings at church. She has a beautiful voice, and eventually she builds up the confidence to join in. She really becomes an indispensable part of this group, and she does take care of Izzy, but she also takes care of all of them in her own teenage way. But of course, nothing good can stay. We know right from the beginning that all of this is temporary. This is a summer job for Mary Jane. These two celebrities are only going to be in town for the summer. And things do begin to change within their familial group as the summer goes on. But I do have to say, things play out in really unexpected ways in this book. This is a really gentle book. And I don't mean that to say that there aren't dramatic moments in this book, because there are certainly a few of those. But I also don't mean that it's gentle in the way that it's pure, because that's also not the case. There are discussions of sex, drugs, alcohol in this book. There's swearing in this book. It's the 70s. But I mean that it's gentle in the way that you don't have to worry every single time you turn the page that something really awful is going to happen to one of these characters who you've grown to care about so much. Coming-of-age stories to me have always meant that a character during a very formative period in their life is exposed to a new way of living, a new way of thinking, and they can compare that against what they've experienced back at home for their entire life up to this point. They can compare the two, and they can start to wrap their head around the idea that they could choose something different than what they grew up with. They can choose a different life than their parents. They can choose different ways of thinking than their parents. And that happens to Mary Jane in a big way. Over the summer, she is introduced to so many new things by working for the Coens. Of course, the out-of-town celebrities definitely provide an education. But more than that, she finds out that there's a different way of being a part of a family. Like I said, back at her house, it's very strict. And while Mary Jane knows on some level that her parents love her, they don't tell her, and they don't really show her much affection. Whereas in this household, they're all telling each other that they love each other. They're showing each other affection. She receives affection, totally appropriate affection. She feels valued, and more importantly, she feels valued for who she is. Now, of course, not everything about the Coen household is an improvement from the way that Mary Jane grew up. The adults in the house are very frequently making mistakes. The house itself is in chaos, and Mary Jane, a teenager, has to rein it all in just to be able to do her job. But also the adults include Mary Jane and Izzy, very young girls, in conversations and situations that are far beyond their respective maturity levels. So that's not great. So in certain ways, Mary Jane's time working in this household makes her almost more appreciative of the way that she's been raised. But those not great things aside, this is such an important summer for Mary Jane because for the very first time, she gets to be a teenage girl. She gets to listen to music and create music and laugh and be reckless and acknowledge the fact that she's starting to think sexual thoughts, which is totally normal for a 14-year-old girl, but she doesn't know that. It's like you get to see her take her first deep breath. You get to see her drink in life over this summer. This one summer, the summer of 1975, opened Mary Jane Dillard's eyes to a world that she previously didn't even know existed. And you can tell that it's the kind of experience that she's going to take with her for the rest of her life. We all know those types of experiences. We use them to inform what we want to do with our lives. And you know that this one summer is going to help Mary Jane decide what kind of a life she wants for herself. Does she want a life more like the Coens? Does she want a life like her mother's? Does she want something in between, or does she want neither entirely? You can see that she now sees that there is a whole world of opportunity and choices out there for her to make. She doesn't have to choose just one path. I absolutely adored this book. I think it's probably now my favorite coming-of-age story of all time. Is it a perfect book? Definitely not. It does require a certain level of suspension of disbelief because certain elements of the story are rather unrealistic. And based on my own knowledge and based on what I've seen people saying about this book, it does seem like the 70s weren't portrayed completely accurately. I wasn't there, so I can't tell you for sure. But even though I'm someone who prefers my stories to be more on the realistic side, I like to believe that things could actually happen in a story, I didn't care when it came to this book. I was willing to suspend disbelief because I loved the writing, I loved the atmosphere, I loved how comforting it was, and most importantly, I loved these characters. But given the fact that this book does take place in the 1970s, there are some things in here that don't completely line up with 2021 sensibilities. Most of those things are addressed by Mary Jane herself as part of her reckoning of sorts with her parents and their way of thinking, as much as a 14-year-old can have that kind of a reckoning. So those things, at least most of those things, are addressed, but I thought I would bring it up just in case that kind of thing bothers you. Despite those things, this was a 5-star read for me. I loved it. I couldn't get enough of it. I loved the characters. I loved the little family that this household created over the course of the summer. The relationship, especially between Mary Jane and Izzy, is absolutely precious. And I loved seeing how much Mary Jane grew over just this one summer. This is definitely more of a relaxed read. It is not action-packed. This one would be perfect to have in your hands if you're by the beach, by the pool, or just out in the sun. I was so devastated as I was getting close to finishing this book because I was not ready for it to be over. I normally feel that way about books that have really touched my heart, and I don't want to let them go, and the thought of letting them go is just heartbreaking. But as I was finishing up this book on audiobook, there was such an incredible, unexpected surprise at the end of the audiobook specifically. Music is a really big part of this book, but toward the end of the book, there is one specific song that becomes very, very important, and you get to read the lyrics. Well, at the end of the audiobook, that is a real song. They turned it into a real full-length, not even just a snippet, a full-length song, and it plays at the end of the audiobook. I don't mean to spoil the surprise. It was a surprise for me, but I know a lot of you out there read in different formats, and oftentimes you'll bounce between those formats. So in case you're trying to figure out what format you should choose with this one, I would highly recommend the audiobook for that reason. It is a wonderful song. It is the perfect way to close out this book. I want to buy that song and put it on my phone and listen to it all the time. I really wish Daisy Jones and the Six would have had that touch. There is so much amazing music discussed in that book, and by the time you get to the end of it, all you want to do is listen to those songs, but you can't because they're not real. So the fact that I got to actually listen to a song from Mary Jane at the end of the audiobook, if I wasn't already going to give it 5 stars, I definitely knew I was going to give it 5 stars when that started playing, and I got to experience that. It was so wonderful. But since I brought up Daisy Jones and the Six, I should mention that the publisher is trying to market this book as though it's similar to Daisy Jones. I wouldn't go into this book expecting that. They are 2 totally different books. They just both happen to be set in the 1970s and include music. If you liked Daisy Jones and the Six for that reason, you might also like this one then. But this book really is excellent. If you're looking for a sweet coming-of-age story to really sink into this summer, I highly recommend it. So that's it for my review. If you have any comments or questions about anything you've seen in this video or about anything in general, please feel free to put those down in the comment section below. If you would like to keep up with what I'm reading and writing about right now, you can find me on various places across the internet, including Goodreads and other social media profiles. The links to everywhere you can find me will be in the description box below, and also in that description box there will be a little section I like to call the further reading section, where I will list some book titles I think you might also enjoy if you really liked this one. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.